All good. And we're live. Facebook, Twitter, Twitch, and YouTube. My name is Jared Budlong. I'm running as an independent candidate in Alabama, and my camera's not working, which I just now realized, and now that we're live. So that's cool. We'll deal with that later. Normally you see my face. Right now you don't. It's okay. This is Tuesday. It is a little past 7 o'clock, so that means this is a campaign meeting, and we're talking about policy, and today we are focusing on education, and specifically education funding. For me at least, one of the biggest frustration points for me has been trying to wrap my head around how we fund our education currently. And I'm not technically to the bottom, but I am to the point where I think we can talk about it and understand why it's not working for our schools across the state in an equitable fashion. So there's a couple things we want to get through. Some reports have been done within the last decade at least. Some of them were in like 2015, so we're getting a little bit old on the data, but there hasn't been anything recently. The fact that we've had complications with COVID for the last 3 years now puts another damper on getting research, because the last 3 years the data is going to be skewed anyway. So we're going to use what we have, and want to go over a couple key things that are important to keep track or keep in mind. So one thing that several of the reports I was looking at, they are looking at a few factors. The first is effort, meaning basically the spending we put into the education system in relationship to our GDP, our gross domestic product for the state specifically. And we're actually rated as a medium, so we're actually not bottom of the pack in that regard. So in relation to how much our state produces, we put in a decent amount in that regard. So we're at about a 3.3% effort level. I don't know the math behind that one because they didn't supply it, but essentially we're sitting middle of the pack for the country as a whole. The next one is funding. We are ranked number 38 in the USA, and that is assuming some controls for wages, poverty, economies of scale, population density, and things like that. So we're not quite at the bottom, but we're still pretty low, and we're spending on average about $8,701 per student across the state. Now that is an average, and we'll get into that in a bit. But one thing I want to point out is that in 2013, at least, the low was about $6,000 per student, and a high was about 12. And there's actually some higher numbers since then, but we'll get into that here in a little bit later. It means that we are spending 53% less than New York and 27% more than I believe it's Idaho. So that's where we're at on the funding side. Coverage, we are about 88% covered, meaning the children that are possible students that are school age, 88% of them are attending public schools. So the other 12% or so, it's 12% are in private or homeschool or other schools that aren't directly the public education schools that we have set up. An interesting tidbit for that is that the ones that are attending private school, a good chunk of them actually have an annual household income at about 171% to those that are in the public school system. So if a family in the public school system earns $100,000 a year, those in the private school earn $171,000 per year. So something to keep in mind, and we're not going to get into it a whole lot here, but something to consider there is they're making a lot more money, but they're not contributing it to the schools, so they're less likely to vote for change, even though the students in the public schools are going to affect them in the long run, because that's the future of our state. But it's an interesting little thing to consider. Our distribution is considered regressive, meaning the schools in our higher poverty areas receive less funding than those in the low poverty areas, which sounds obvious, but it's not always the case. It is in our state for sure. And then that's the four key things that people were looking at. The big one is the regressive piece, where we're actually spending less on the communities that need the money more. But that's kind of the thing that I've been mentioning the entire time when somebody brings up anything about funding, is we want to make sure we're not putting a burden or taking away from those that are already impoverished, because those are the people that need that state help more in the first place. So we want to jump into the foundation program. So that is how we determine what funding goes to what schools. So this is different than there's another part of the state code and law that we could get into, but this one's specifically about how we distribute the funding. So it was created in 1995. The big thing to keep in mind is that it determines the budget first and then figures out where the funding comes from after that. So the funding budget is determined by our average daily membership, which we had a previous guest who kind of hinted on this previously, but the ADM, the average daily membership, which is calculated 20 days after Labor Day, is used to calculate everything else that we talk about. So K through 3, for instance, is 14.25 students per teacher unit, SPTU. 4th through 6th grade is 21 SPTUs. 7th through 8th is 19.7 SPTUs, and then 9th through 12th is 17.95. And I just realized I could probably share this and it would make following along a little bit easier since you can't see my face even. So let me share this real quick. If I can get over there. Okay, so we just went over some numbers real quick, just read through down the bullet point notes that I've had here, but we've got our ADM to staff ratio essentially. It's not really a staff ratio, it's a teacher unit ratio. It's not actually teachers. So they're not saying that each teacher or each 14.25 students gets a teacher, they get a teacher unit. And then those units are used to calculate not only staffing, but also materials, tech, library enhancement, professional development. And what I didn't have time to find was this next piece right here, which is we don't account for the individual cost for special needs cases. So English language learners, anybody living in poverty, anybody with special needs, none of those are calculated on an individual level. We essentially set a pre-described percentage boost of whatever the calculations are. So if let's say a school with a certain number of students, let's say it's 300 students, whatever the number is, they would automatically just get a boost of 2% of funding for an assumed average number of people who need help with English language, even though that school system may have a 20 or 30% students who need help with ELL. We don't account for that. So we're actually putting that burden back on the school to figure that out later. We're not calculating that into our costs. And that's a huge frustration point for a lot of teachers and administrators, not just the teachers, but everybody in the system. And then also, obviously, the students and parents who are trying to get that help. The thing that one of our previous guests mentions is, if you have to hit a certain threshold in order to get that ELL help, if you don't meet the threshold, you don't get the help. So like you wouldn't even get one, let's say, counselor or one ELL teacher if you don't meet the minimum threshold in order to get that extra help. So there are places where they don't even get the bare minimum, they get nothing essentially. So it's a huge frustration point. And then this is the part where it gets kind of complicated, and I joked with everybody before we went live that you gotta think about some math. And so your total budget gets determined, and then each district, remember we get the budget first, and then the schools the source of the funding then gets picked from there. So there are 3 places you can get funding. You can get federal, state, or local funding. The averages for our state for federal funding is 10 to 14%, state is 62 to 65%, and then local is 22 to 25%. This is all determined partially by your local property taxes. So before anything happens, from what I can find, we find the budget first, and then each district in the state has to contribute 10 mills, which this is where it gets complicated, and this is why a lot of people don't talk about it. A mill is essentially $1 for every $1,000 of assessed property value. So if you have a property worth $100,000, then they would pay $100 out of that. That's what the ad valorem tax would be. The confusion point, or the complicated part, is that in our state, we designated specific properties as current use properties, category 3, and those are things like residential, forest, and agricultural properties, and those are actually assessed at 10% of their fair market value. So if your property is normally fair market would be worth $100,000, it is assessed at $10,000, and then this district collects 10 mils of that value. So they only end up getting, $100 instead of $1,000, if that math is roughly following. But we're taking even smaller chunks of any residential, forest, or agricultural property, which, if anybody's paying attention, we're talking about the poorer communities, which aren't going to have other property types. Mostly it's going to be residential, forest, and agricultural areas, and all of their properties are worth less to the state for the purposes of funding. So the example here is that even if we ignored the Cat 3 restrictions, meaning they weren't assessed at a lower rate, the ad valorem tax is still an inequitable way of funding our schools. So Lowndes County, we've talked about them in the past, if they were to take 1 mil of property taxes in 2020, you have about $112,000 worth of tax revenue. Mountain Brook would be $612,890, and then Birmingham City, the larger area, would be $2,520,000. And that's assuming that there's no difference in property types. It's just saying, assessed value. So Lowndes County, their school district, would be responsible for this amount. Mountain Brook would be this amount, and then Birmingham City would be this. That's not an equitable way to fund the schooling system based on property values. And we've talked about that a bit in the past. The other part to keep in mind is that the way we're funding things, especially with local taxes, not always property, but local taxes, is those are affected by the economy in drastic ways. So something that was pointed out is the per pupil expenditure, PPE, in 2018 was still 15% below the recession levels of 2008. And currently, at least when this was reported, 220 of our schools rely on the state for 75% or more of their funding. So we said that average was 62 to 65, but again, that's an average. And there are some schools, 220 of them roughly, that rely on the state for 75% of that funding because of the lower tax revenue that's coming in locally. And when we talked about earlier how the AVT, even if it was equal, the ad valorem tax, in 2018, they mentioned that the lowest spending middle school, which is in Eufaula, they compared it to one of the highest spending middle schools, which is in Vestavia Hills, and there was a difference of $9,109 per student. That's a difference, which if we scroll back up the page, our average per student is $8,701. So the difference between these lowest spending school and highest spending school is more than the average that we spend on our students across the state. And 6,700 of that comes from those local resources that one system literally just doesn't have access to. So that the students in Liberty Park and Vestavia Hills received twice the average spending, essentially, and the majority of that extra came from their local taxes and resources. This last little footnote I put in here because somebody put in the comments in one of the videos and asked to look into increasing teacher supply spending, and from what I could find, that's actually pre-described in the law. There might be some calculations that can be done with the foundation program, but in Alabama state code, it literally says you get $300 for your class, and that was a hard written amount, not a calculation, and it was done in last updated in 2012 at least. So that's kind of where we're at. We do not fund things by the student. We are funding things based on an average of what a school system should, quote unquote, expect, and then make the school make up the difference. And that's something that one of our guests in the past brought up, was that we we do not account for each student's needs, and that's one of the things that I want us to start looking into. So one of the things that I found during the research side was an article, or actually it was a paper rather, written in 2016. Robert's jumping in. Let's see. It was a paper written in 2016 by Brittany Larkin, and they mentioned actually inverting that model and spending based on the student rather than doing averages and then making the school make up the differences. And they would actually weight per student. So as an example, currently we get an added 2.5% for their total population, even though every system has more than 5% of the population identified as special needs. So we're not, like, again, we're doing it as an average, not as a specific need for that specific school or even the district level, doing a count and saying, hey, last year we had 300 students who are ELL, English language learners. We're going to be roughly in that same position next year unless something drastic changes. Instead, we're just like, we treat it as an average. It's like, all right, well, the state has an average of 2 students per 500 or whatever the actual number is, that making that percentage up. And then if your school is higher, you have to find a way to supplement your funding to help those other students. So that's kind of where we're at. My brain hurts just from walking through all of that. Does anybody have any questions for what we just talked about? And I will do my best to explain it from what I understand. Oh, and we have chat. I've been doing a lot of reading, so let me jump in. Let's see. Sarah mentioned that this is why education is so poor in southern states. And actually, Sarah, one of the reports we were looking at, the one from 2016 from the Auburn teacher or professor at the time, they cite a study requested by the Alabama State Department of Education in 2015, where they actually compared our state to other states that do things similar to us. They use a foundation program or something similar to us, and we're still, even in that situation, we're still doing a poor job of getting funding to these schools. So I'll have I'm going to put all of these notes in my ongoing research document that everybody's been looking at on the screen a moment ago. There's some footnotes already, a couple more that I have to add back in. But those are referenced there as well. But yes, that is definitely one of the reasons. Amanda's asking, Alabama puts the most ridiculous things into law. Is there any reason given for everything going straight to code? I mean, outside of what we've talked about in the past, Amanda, where our state wants in its constitution, the intention for that constitution was to instill white supremacy into law. Quite literally. Outside of that, they don't give anything currently outside of that's what we've always done. So let's just keep putting stuff into law, and especially into hard numbers, like the ridiculous $300 for school supplies. Like, who would ever think that a hard number would be permanently good to have on record? Like our something we actually skipped over is slightly skipped over. We talked about it. We didn't go into detail, is the property values, right? So we talked about how category 3 current use properties are assessed at 10%, but that's literally in the Constitution. Like, we would have to amend our Constitution to fix that funding mechanism. So if we wanted to tax the large the owners of large tracts of land that are just holding it for trees or using it for lumber, whatever it is, we would have to amend our constitution to start taxing them at a more equitable rate so that they can help fund the rest of the state for education, healthcare, whatever. But it's literally locked into our constitution at this point. So I know I've been talking a ton. I want to make sure anybody else has any other questions. Amanda, you said it's all BS, just voicing how wild it is. 100%. I will never turn down the opportunity to mention how ridiculous it is that we literally wanted to put white supremacy into our laws so that it would promulgate across society. So that, go look that up. Footnote number 9 on the Wikipedia article for the Alabama Constitution, 1901. Go look it up. It's a state hosted website, not Wikipedia, but the footnote leads directly to a state site. So, all right, everybody's muted. So somebody chime in. Everybody's still muted. There we go.
I think you already know that math is like.
Oh yeah, no, we're not going to do math now. Like what we're.
What?
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to ask how it's divided out by. What is it? The mills you said?
So it's not divided by. It's not necessarily divided by mills. That's just the bare minimum. Each district has to pay 10 mills. And that gets taken away from the funding that the state then distributes.
Is it like, so do they determine what each school gets by the property taxes?
No, so they take each student. So there's a bit more math that we didn't actually get into. But
right, okay.
Yeah, I didn't want it to get that mathy. We can, if you guys really want to. I can pull up the references, but essentially the ADM, the average daily membership number, which is the number of students who are attending school 20 days after Labor Day, that arbitrary number that they pick at the beginning of the school year for the next year's staffing and everything. Those numbers are used in correlation to the staff or the student per teacher unit ratios we mentioned earlier. So the 14.25, the 21.03, 19.7, 17.95 for the different ages. Those are used to create a system unit. So, depending on how many students you have in each grade, and I'm moving my hands up and down like you guys can see me. My camera's still not coming on, so let me go back to the.
I can see you on TikTok if that helps.
No, everybody else can't. So let's go back to the sheet. So here, and I'll zoom in a little bit and make that a little easier to see on video.
Also, while you're doing that, somebody on TikTok said, "Ain't no way I'm voting for a closet liberal," and I was like, "Who's in a closet?"
I mean, we'd have to define the term liberal first, but I don't normally identify as a liberal. So.
Well, I also said, I was like, he's a pretty outspoken. He's not hiding anything.
Nope.
So.
All right.
Okay. So how? Okay. All right.
Yeah. So.
Now that you've confused us all with math.
Yeah. Well, so the idea here, though, is right now the problem that most people are pointing out is that we're not calculating budget based on student needs. We're calculating it based on the number of students and an average need for that number of students across the state. So it's not like each school gets to determine how they're going to spend their funding, but their funding is a generically determined amount based on percentages and averages. Mm-hmm. So it's not like, oh, hey, we're in a district that has, a high percentage of ELL students, so English language learners, who are also high poverty. They don't get a bump in funding based on that. They get funding based on how much they can supply in the first place, which it's not a direct correlation there. Like it doesn't.
So basically, is it the more money you can pay, the more money you get?
No, it's supposed to. You get a budget,
well,
so yeah. So you're.
lost.
Yeah, no, right? So, yes. So, for round numbers, and if anybody's watching this later, this is not me trying to get an actual example. We're just trying to do ballpark ideas here. So, like, if you had your budget was $100,000, right? You are that is what they want to give you, right? So that's what the state knows you need $100,000, right? Before they give you anything, you have to contribute the 10 mils. So that is unrelated to this budget. That is just a percentage of your district's property value. So it's unrelated to the two. So in theory, the state would be adding extra funding to the districts that can't pay for their own budget. So if school A, so if we say school A can contribute, $25,000 based on their mill, right? And school B can contribute $50,000 due to their mill. Here we go. Trying to keep my mic from being in my purview. Then on the first one, the state would then make up through federal and state funding would make up the other 75,000, right? And then on school B, they would make up the other 50. What that's not accounting for though is school B might be able through local taxes and other things be able to add an extra $90,000 through local taxes, whereas this school can only add another 10,000 through local taxes. Right? So and that's assuming that these schools need the same budget in the first place, right? But just hypothetically, let's say it's two areas that have the same ratio of students identically, but their property values are vastly different. One would be able to support themselves in regards to the budget that the school knows that they need. They would be able to pay for more of that, so the state would pay them less. But then they can also add more to their program, like Vestavia Hills that we mentioned earlier. If I scroll down a little bit, where was that? It may not have been that far. It may have been up further. Oh, I don't know where it is. Where's my Vestavia? Yeah, well, Mountain Brook, that's not it. Where's my Vestavia one? Here we go. So that's kind of what they're talking about here with Moore Middle School in Eufaula versus Liberty Park and Vestavia. Vestavia was able to add an extra $9,000 per student based on their local tax revenue, above and beyond the budget, from what I gather from the report, above and beyond the budget necessary from the report. From the budget rather. So the state said you need X. They got all of that funding, and then they also spent an extra $9,000 per student based on how much they could raise locally through either property tax or business taxes that they've decided to use for school funding and things like that.
So I got a question.
Yeah.
So which maps are used to determine the calculation, and who controls the maps? So is it like poorly gerrymandered, like voting, or is it?
Oh, who determines the districts?
I guess, yeah.
That I actually don't have the answer to that. I'm not sure who determines the districts. Not offhand. Part of it is the schools themselves. So like in my area, for instance, Baldwin County Board of Education, two of our schools recently, I think seceded is the right word. Like they dropped out of the school district and made their own. So like they were like, hey, we're tired of being in your school district, so they dropped out and did their own. And it's for reasons like this though. It's Orange Beach and Gulf Shores. They're high tourist locations, so they're in their head in their calculations. I have to assume, not a part of the conversations, but they know that they could raise the funds better for themselves rather than share that revenue with the rest of Baldwin County, because they saw it as, and again, this is me speaking on their behalf, not intentionally, but just this is how I perceived it as a person who doesn't live in those areas, but is still affected by that decision. It seemed like, hey, we are bringing in more revenue into Baldwin County Board of Education, but we're not getting as much out of it. So we'll become our own school board. or our own school district. It could have been that, or they just didn't like some of the decisions that were being made around rules and and requirements during the school year on things that you have to wear potentially.
Yeah.
It was around that same time. If you follow where I'm going.
So
Go ahead.
what? Well, I was just gonna say, what can you, as the governor,
Yeah.
what
What can we do?
now that we're all thoroughly befuddled.
Yeah. So there's actually been some research done that talks about two main ways to affect change, right? So there's alternate policy ideas, and one of it is to change tax policies. So in order to bring in more tax revenue, the downside is literally there. It's in the Constitution, so literally that's not me. I can't change the Constitution. That's up to the legislature, who then has to present it to you all, the people, me as well. I'd have to vote on it, but not as governor. I wouldn't be able to make that decision. We as a people would have to rely on the legislature to want to do this in the first place, then agree to do it on through a normal legislative session, and then we as the people would have to vote on it on top of that. So that's the honestly probably the best way, so that we could get more equitable funding across everywhere, but it's the hardest one to pull off because of the constitutional amendment piece. The other one would be shifting the funding distribution method. So it would help spread it out more evenly, even though we need more funding, which is something we talk about regularly. We do need more funding, but it's unlikely we can fix at least the current limitations that have been discussed widely in research, which is the property tax piece. I'm not a huge fan of using property tax as a way to value or a way to fund education, because of the problems we're talking about. Even if we fix some of the ad valorem tax issue, the class 3 property values that they are assessed at 10% of their actual value. Even if we fix that, there's still, like it's on screen right now, there's still an inequitable funding revenue there. So we're still having problems with being able to fund our students equally or equitably. So the big thing that we're going to try and do is actually shift how the funding is distributed, and that's where I want us to spend the next 15 or 20 minutes, if we can get into it that far, is come up with some things that we need to keep in mind when talking about funding. So it's kind of just reverse engineering what we're not doing now versus continuing down this path. So the big thing for me is actually starting at the student level. So if we're talking about future ideas, we've got to start with student needs first, and then create a budget off of that, right? Which creates the budget. Then we find the sources for that budget. So right now we're finding the budget first, finding the sources and splitting it up based on the ad valorem tax essentially, and then from there the schools distribute it as best they can and fund their teachers, their counselors, their libraries, their counselors, and all of those pieces after they have the budget. But I think if we flip that on its head and start with student needs first, so we have to find a base student cost, right? So that one should be pretty straightforward. It's like, hey, what is an average student cost to give them an education every year? And that would probably still need the breakdown of different grade levels. So we would need a grade breakdown of some type, right? So we're still going to need that. If I can spell it out today, grade breakdown, for instance, it's K through 3, 4 through 6, 7 through 9, I think are the examples. We don't have to use these, but 10 through 12, I think one of those is wrong, but it's fine. We'll use some kind of grade breakdown, because the high schoolers may need more funding because they have different programming needs. But finding out those rough student cost breakdowns for the student cost, right? And then from there we would add on things like the ELL cost, things like whatever some kind of poverty. What is the right word for that here? So it's a poverty, like, I hate to use the word modifier, but it's, it's some type of balancing mechanism for poverty. We'll find a better word for it, but the idea there is anybody who's living in abject poverty or an area of high concentration of poverty, there are other mechanisms that have to be overcome just straight due to poverty, whether that's food or just needing the extra time with tutors because they don't have the extra time at home with their parents because they're working 3 jobs, whatever the case is. That would need an extra. Those students need extra resources as well. We talked about just special needs in general, so we have to add some type of modifier for those. What are some other things that we are not accounting for so far?
I was gonna say, I also feel like food. We shouldn't force kids to have to pay for food when we legally require them to be there.
Yeah.
And kids in abject poverty already, there's a struggle.
Right.
So you may live like right above that line that qualifies for a free or reduced lunch, and it still will put a strain on you.
Right.
Especially as you were saying, if parents are working 3 jobs just to make ends meet, are they there in the morning to be able to prepare a lunch? So
yeah,
I think.
All right, so Austin is on Facebook. I want to make sure I don't ignore his comment. Needs to be a complete rework of the way schools are funded. Yeah, school systems in impoverished areas deserve the same funding as picket fenced neighborhoods. Yeah, 100%, and then it cuts off. So I'm gonna, or no, actually it doesn't. That was the whole thing. Yeah, we're working on that, and it's the problem is making sure we think about all of the variations that different communities would need, right? So we have to think about all of the situations that require extra funding for those students to get the same quality education and can progress at the same rate that the rest of our students do. I think Becca, transportation. Yes, thank you. So
Yeah,
we've got to account for
thinking.
we've got to account for transportation. Thank you, Becca. And actually, I don't know if that's in my notes here or not, but transportation. Let's see if it's in my notes earlier. No, it's not. Transportation isn't accounted for in the system units. I think they do it via ADM. So again, it's done on an average, not by the actual needs of those students in that specific school or that specific district. So yes, transportation for sure.
Which I think is one thing. I don't want to say it's perfect, but um, you'll always have every kid has a bus to ride.
Right.
I will say that's
at least available to them. Yeah.
Right.
Did teacher salaries get mentioned? Club, sports, music, and arts. Oh, that's a good question. That the teachers' salaries are determined by a recommendation by the Alabama Department of Education to the legislation and the governor each year, I believe. But that is not a part of. It's not a part of the calculations. So the calculations are. It kind of is, but not directly what we're talking about. It's accounted for, but not in what we've talked about so far. I'll say it that way. But this is more the student cost, right? So we're talking about the student cost first, and that I would, we could do cost of living for the teacher in the area, right? So that would make sense for us to consider regarding the teacher's wages. There would potentially be a base salary, but then each district would have a potentially a higher cost of living for teachers, so that would be an additional add to their budget. So that's actually a good point. Thank you, Anna, for bringing that up.
Teachers are leaving the career of teaching. They're not just leaving like schools or districts. They're leaving the career in and of itself because of the poop show that this is.
Yeah, and for us, from what I've gathered, at least in ours, from the few teachers that I've been able to speak to directly, the a part of the issue. It's funding related, but it's not just money. It's where the money gets put. So if we bring more money in and it goes straight to the football program, well, like that doesn't help the teachers who are ready to quit because they don't have enough help to handle the the 32 kids that are in their class when they're only supposed to have 25, right? And like that's another part of it. So cost of living for teachers. We also need to account for the student to teacher ratios. So let's do student to teacher ratio. Let's figure out what research based, right? So research based ratios.
Hey Jared, do you know how to tie your shoes?
I do. Is somebody in the comments being weird?
Yeah, that's several of us that know how to tie. I mean, I prefer slip-ons, but
they're a lot easier to get out of the house. You just slip them on and go, right?
Yeah. So that's 4 out of 5 independents do know how to tie their shoes.
Love it. Okay, so student teacher ratio. We've got to add the cost of living for teachers. I feel like I need to start this on a new line so that it's less distracting as we're typing. There we go. Start with the student's needs first. All right, so we'll start with the base student cost with grade breakdowns, adding EOL, poverty modifier, special needs costs, food cost for every student, transportation, and we mentioned sports earlier. Or we'll just say extracurricular, so we can cover all of those. Let's see, extracurricular. Let's see, what else did we miss?
Did you include like medical costs in there?
Becca, what do you mean? I'm not sure I understand.
I mean, when you go to the clinic, that just like the nurse's office or whatever, you have to have a certain amount of medicines in there, and you also have to have all of these. You have to have, what are the words? Atrial defibrillators. You have to have fire extinguishers. You have to have.
Yeah, that wouldn't be a variation. I don't think, unless I'm misunderstanding. I don't think that would be a variation per district. That would be something I think we could average, unless I'm not thinking of something. Like would have.
But also,
go ahead.
Not every school is required to have one, which I think they should be.
Okay, so that wouldn't be a modifier, but we could do under the basic needs, right? So that is textbooks. We could say medical staffing and supplies. But and what else we mentioned? Like AED. Is it AED or ADE? What's the acronym?
Wait, what? What is the AED? What is the what?
The automatic defibrillator. What is the acronym for it? Does anybody know?
I'm not sure.
AED.
It is AED.
I had
okay.
to Google it.
Yep.
Yeah.
Just making sure. That's what I typed out, but I wanted to make sure I was getting the right acronym there. And so we've got textbooks, medical, staffing, and supplies. Let me put a ampersand there. AED equipment. So that's all the stuff that we would need per student, no matter the district. Like there's not going to be I don't think that there would be a difference between District A and District B for the cost of textbooks, the amount and cost of supplies and medical staffing per student. Although the medical staffing is probably closer to the student teacher ratio. It's not teacher, so it's student to what would be we'll say staff ratios. There we go.
Is the guidance counselor figured into all of that?
So teachers, counselor. Hold on. That is not how you spell counselor. We're doing this live. There we go. Teachers, counselors, admin staff, janitorial, meals, etc. We'll look at those and figure out what the actual numbers are. We don't want to overlook anybody just by thinking we have a final count, but we'll take a look at it. We want to make sure we have all of the staff that we would need. the question, I guess, part of this, that's general staff, right? So I guess the question, though, if we're talking about the
Throw aid in there.
what's that?
Teacher aid.
Yeah. AIDS, right? So the what I was going to say though is some of these the aids may not be a uniform distribution though. So like we mentioned earlier in the poverty stricken areas, they may need more aids. So
Oh yeah. It'll
So-
it'll fully depend on, and it'll depend on special needs and all that good stuff.
so individual education plan modifiers. So we'll have to look up what these look like, what these are later. Again, this is a work in progress. That's kind of the point of having these as a meeting. So that would be that could be counselors. Let me spell it correctly this time. Oops, counselors, aides. What else would be needed for an individual education plan, if we're talking about modifying the base outside of an aide and extra counselors? What else might be needed for that? Oh, tutors.
Anna brought up a good point.
Yeah.
Besides, outside of IEP modifiers, security.
Yeah. So with that,
That could fall under an IEP modifier, by the way.
the educate or the security.
A specific type of security. But it could, yeah. Yeah, resource officer. I don't want to say resource officer. But
Yeah. Okay.
I'm trying to say it politely.
Yeah. No, I got you. I'm gonna put a question mark next to security and figure out where it needs to go because I don't have an answer for that. So we're gonna have to look into how that needs to be distributed and whether or not that needs to be district specific or not. So Anna, you said equipment also. Some schools have scanners. Oh, you're talking about the added security. Yeah, I feel like the security side would be universal. But we'll have to talk about that again another time. We need to look into whether or not adding personnel is beneficial. And if we're going to add, if we're talking about adding scanners, then why would we protect one area more than another? That doesn't seem okay to me. So we'd have to look into that a little bit more. So Caleb mentioned that most of the time security in an IEP is going to be a licensed teacher being in the room at all times.
There are certain behavioral problems that can become dangerous.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm speaking from.
Yeah. So we'll say specialized teacher then. I mean that's.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. It can be someone who can, I don't want to use the word subdue, but
no, they can de-escalate situations. You're good.
De-escalate, yeah.
Yeah.
My mom worked with special needs kids, and she had a kid pull a knife on her. So, and that can be any child.
Yeah.
However,
No, I got you. You're good. So I'll just put it in specialized teachers, and we'll talk about that later. This is more of us just trying to get one more step down the road for coming up with a plan that can actually equitably fund our schools. So we're not claiming this is the end all be all. So Anna, you said not in favor of adding security, just assuming some districts are having these costs pulled from their budgets and maybe not other districts. Yes. Yeah. Oh, and Caleb, you're actually a specialized or a licensed special ed teacher with restraint training. Awesome. Yeah, and if we're missing anything, please mention it, Caleb. Like that's kind of the whole point of this meeting. Like if there's anything for special ed that we need to call out specifically as a modifier for the base student cost, like that is the kind of stuff we're looking for. And if you don't have it off the top of your head, send a message through the feedback form. I'd be happy to take that later. This is an ongoing project. So extracurricular activities, I put sports, arts, and Anna mentioned a few others. I'm going to put etc. and have us add to that list later. All right, so that so right now we have our base student cost, and right now that's that's textbooks, medical supplies, AED. That would be food. Actually, I'm going to move that to the base cost because we're talking for every student. So food is actually a part of the base cost, planning for every kid to have access to food, breakfast and lunch available. Let's see. Jumped in. Did you add in technology for communication? We didn't in there yet, but we can add textbooks and we can add technology. So that's the everyday classroom technology there. Most of what I'm looking for right now, Caleb, is the modifier pieces, so that we're not overlooking that part, especially if you have insight onto that. Oh, okay. You're actually talking about special education. Okay, yeah. So that actually is a good idea. So that's, sorry, let me say it out loud since I'm reading off of TikTok. Kayla was mentioning things like smart pads for students with communication disorders. So that's actually a good point. So specialized tech, and I'm going to put in, you said smart pads? Yeah. We'll put that in the list for sure. Don't need a endless supply of parentheses in our document. That's just going to get hard to read. Okay. Let's see. I think we're good there. The student to staffing ratios. So we've got teachers, aides, counselors, admin staff, janitorial, meals, etc. Make sure we do that off of research and what's needed per student, essentially, what actually makes the most sense. Now, modifying the staff ratios or the pay for that staff ratio. We have our cost of living, so that's you're going to vary some. Uh-oh. My TikTok live just shut off. Oops. I think we're going everywhere else, though. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah, the live has ended.
Yeah. It literally just gave me an error and said live couldn't continue. So we may have just gotten... I may have just got my first community guidelines violation on TikTok.
What did you do?
Oh, absolutely nothing. But that's kind of the point. It's usually never justified. So I'll deal with that later. So we have our student to staff ratios. What else would affect? See, cost of living is actually not a change on the student to staff ratios, but it's something we have to consider. Is there anything that would affect the student to staff ratio? That isn't mentioned earlier. I can't think of anything else that would add to it other than the stuff we mentioned earlier, like English language, special needs classes, and then like IEP stuff for those specific needs. So I think we're good there. What other things do we think we need to consider for the cost of the costs of the schools? What else are we not thinking of? And obviously we're going to keep going and doing research in the back end, but we have like 2 minutes. So if we can think of anything, great. If not, then we will probably end and keep going in the background, and then in another policy meeting later on, once we've put some more thought into these, and kind of go over what we're changing and why we're addressing those in a later meeting. But if nobody has anything, I think we had a rather productive policy meeting, even without the camera going. Hopefully it wasn't super boring for everybody else watching. Let me jump back over.
Are you going to keep us posted on why you got kicked off?
I'll try. Yeah, I'm going to jump back to the comments, though, because it looks like Wilson showed up. Corey showed up and is chatting about some stuff. So Rocket City's treating us well. It treated us with a lot of rain this weekend. We got rained out of Huntsville and Birmingham, so that was unfortunate. Let's see.
It wasn't just rain. It was like lightning, and it was yeah. Yeah. So Wilson, Corey, dang it, your name starts with Wilson for the people. So Corey mentioned using the consumer price index for adjusting for the cost of living. That's a perfect idea. And let's see.
Stop making teachers buy their own supplies. That's a
Yeah.
very good point. So let's address classroom supplies. So that, I think, is actually a part of the base student cost. I think. Right? Am I misunderstanding where that would go? Because that's kind of a, like, for every student you're going to need X amount of you know, pencils, paper, tissue, you know, Kleenex, Clorox wipes, and all of the stuff that we usually have to buy at the beginning of school anyway, to help supplement the lack of funding. All of that would be on a per student basis, essentially.
I think I was about to say, I think that's also something to take into consideration. The fact that some parents, buying school supplies is a huge burden.
Yeah, no, 100%. Let's see. So if we build more schools, we can reduce class sizes. Agreed, Corey. In New York City, there's a program that allows professionals from their field to teach with their specialty. That's super cool. We need folks who have an education background and more educators running for office, become educators by allowing for industry professionals with clean background checks and state education certification can be useful as we prepare to fight this nation's educator exodus, which is what Taylor was mentioning earlier. Yeah.
It is bad.
Yep. Cool. Okay. So definitely reducing the ratio. So we'll be doing that via research to figure out what those numbers actually are, because I know they vary by age essentially. So okay, cool. Well, we'll stop here. We'll continue this on at another policy meeting. We'll do some research in the background to figure out what these numbers actually are and kind of how they break down. And we're gonna take this as far as we can. The point behind doing all of this is making sure I'm well versed on what actually needs to happen and how this should take place, but also, if we can take it far enough, we can actually just propose this and say, hey, Corey, you and all of our other legislators who care about better education, like, here's the work. We did the work, double check it, make sure we didn't miss anything, but, like, here you go.
Check our math.
Propose it. Like, put it through. I would love to sign it, but I need you guys to sign off on it first. Because it's, again, there's some limited power in the position of governor, and we want to do everything I can in my power to improve education and healthcare. Some of that is beyond my direct control. So we're trying to do some of that research ahead of time, and that way we can make informed decisions, but also, again, if we can go far enough, let's just hand it over and say, here you go. So Corey, keep giving us input. Let us know if you want to jump on a policy meeting on another Tuesday to talk about education, because I know you're passionate about it. Please do. Let me know what Tuesday you're available, and we will set that time aside for you to jump on and help us think through some of these policy changes. So for everybody else who's still watching, I appreciate you tuning in. We will be live next Tuesday from 7 o'clock until 8 for another policy meeting. On Saturdays from 9 to 10 with weather, travel, and volunteer sickness / hospital visits for new babies. Congratulations, Alice. Notwithstanding, we will have meetings from 9 to 10 for our strategy, and from 10 to 11 for field operations. So every Tuesday, 7 o'clock, every Saturday from 9 to 10, and from 10 to 11, we have regular campaign meetings, odd scheduling notwithstanding. So y'all have a great rest of the night. I will talk to everybody soon.